Conversation today about the failures of whiteness for white people. Oftentimes, when we're talking about these things, we're talking about the ways in which systemic racism has been designed to basically screw us up as black people. But we also got to be clear about the fact that systemic racism is doing a really good job at screwing up white people in ways that make it difficult for them to sort of understand how to navigate, how to move forward, because they are so rooted in some concepts that we really got to unpack. And so I want to provide a bit of a history lesson today. And then we're going to be taking your calls in the second hour of the show at 866-801-8255. But first, we have to lay some foundations, because when I look at what's happening in Kerr County and the floodwaters and the reports coming out of Kerr County where we had over 100 people dead, where there's still many, many missing, it has been an absolute devastating reality. And my heart absolutely goes out to these people who have been navigating this reality. But I realize that we also have to do a little bit of historical analysis to understand how it is that we got here. So we're going to do that today because y'all know I believe in the principle of Sankofa. And Sankofa is that African principle that basically says you got to look to the past to understand where you're at and where you're trying to go today. And so we're going to do a little bit about that. Now, it's important to remember that whiteness as a concept, as an organizing concept, is a fairly new concept, historically speaking. It did not exist in any meaningful ways as an organizing principle really prior to the 1600s. And in my podcast, Larry Breaks It Down, which comes out every day at 2 p.m. and then 6 a.m. For 2 different episodes each day, we have had a number of conversations with a brother by the name of Dante King. He is excellent at describing these concepts. And so if you want more understanding as to the nature and the history and the organizing structures of whiteness, I encourage you to go to the podcast to take a listen. But we learned through those conversations and through the texts that Dante King has written, among others, that European Americans really began first referring to themselves as white in the mid 1600s. And that was really an effort of describing like who could and could not be enslavable. And it was a way of determining the rights that the non-enslavable class would have over the enslavable. And so white people began, I think it was 1649, I think it is. Don't quote me on the number. It might have been 1662. I gotta go back and look at my notes. But basically, around the mid 1600s, we see for the first time white people, Europeans, I should say, European Americans, using the phrase white in their legal structures, in their laws, and in their legislation. And again, they were using the word white as a way of distinguishing who had power in the society and who did not. And so that's when we began seeing the concept of whiteness really as an organizing principle. And frankly, it was a pretty cool trick for the rich white people, because they had spent decades prior to this moment really trying to convince poor white people to be good farmers. Now, poor white people were coming from Europe. They were using a system known as indentured servitude. Some of you kind of may remember learning about this in school, for those of you who went to schools that actually taught things. But they were basically Europeans, poor whites, would come to America through a system known as indentured servitude, where they would sign a contract and work for, 5 to 7 years. And then after the 5 to 7 years of working in the new land for the wealthy European landowner who had gotten there before them, they would be freed from their indenture, having completed the terms of their contract. And then they would often be given a plot of land and a bucket of seed so that they could farm and become landowners in their own right. Now, this was very promising for poor white people, even though the ship rides from Europe to the United States was absolutely devastating and terrible. Now, it was nowhere near as devastating and terrible as the transatlantic slave trade, where traveling death camps and concentration ships were floating bodies across the water to be funneled into the enslavement system. But for European Americans, it was pretty bad. Like the trip itself was awful. But you got to consider that this was a time when Europe was a germ-infested, disease-prone, non-soap having wasteland of filth, where like rats and the poor were essentially competing for food, and in an effort to avoid catching the bubonic plague, which is wiping out Europeans by the tens of thousands. And in addition to being poor, there were a whole lot of criminals in European jails who were being kicked out of jails and then...
Hi everyone, guys, welcome back to AfriVlog, where we break down the uncomfortable truths, raw and real. And let me say this, we don't own a right to the clips used in these videos, and let all the credits go to the owners of these videos. Now, today we are going to talk about something that many are too much afraid to say it loud, and that is the whiteness failing, and they can't believe it. That system, that skin-based privilege that once guaranteed favors, power, and unearned advantages is cracking, meaning it is failing. But how did we get here at first? How did we get here, good people? I want us to break down, and before that, I want us to watch some clips here that I just sampled from TikTok and other creators. And if you get time, please follow them in their respective pages and channels. Let's dive straight watch these videos, then come back.
Into indentured servitude, because Europeans were like, well, we don't want your criminal asses here, so we're going to kick you on out, send you on these ships, and send you to America where they can deal with you here. And basically, the idea was that if you had been imprisoned, you were ripe for slave labor, because prison labor is, I guess, a part of the colonial European mindset. Suffice it to say, these were not the best of times for the poor whites. Not the best of times. And so indentured servitude was like, here you go. Indentured servitude was like, you know how like playing ball or rapping is seen as something like an escape for kids who were in the ghetto. Like when I was coming up in the 80s and 90s, you either played ball or you rapped. And that was sort of seen as your ticket out. Indentured servitude was like the basketball rapping track out of the European ghettos. And so a lot of poor whites was like, what I'm going to do is get on these ships. I'm going to go be an indentured servant and I'm going to get access to this land. And when they got to the new land, it was also a challenge, because just like today's poor whites, these poor white, uneducated and criminal class of white ancestors did not know how to read. They did not know how to do math. And most importantly, for these purposes and for the purposes of this conversation, they didn't know how to farm anything. They couldn't grow nothing but pestilence and lice. And so they were really bad on the actual land. And so wealthy farmers who had already tried to enslave the indigenous, which was very unsuccessful, they began then turning away from indentured servitude and embracing the transatlantic slave trade, because back then white boys and girls were terrible at farming and keeping themselves alive. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, I mean, that shit ain't changed. In fact, Amina, if you could please pull up the clip where we have the complaints about the white farmers today who basically, right, because right now we got entire farms where they are saying, we need you to come volunteer. We need you to come. They are asking nurses now. They're asking nurses in rural America as a part of their HR profile and going up the clinical ladder. They're saying, if you go pick some blueberries, because we got all these blueberries, ain't nobody here to pick the blueberries because the migrants and the immigrants ain't no longer here. They are doing everything they can to get white people to come out into these fields. And it's as bad now as it was back then. Take a listen to this clip. I'm not being hyperbolic. I'm not being disrespectful. It just is what it is. Take a listen to these farmers talk about how hard it is to get white people to come out and work in these farms for any length of time. Take a listen.
Keith Smith says most immigration workers left after the law took effect. So this potato farmer hired Americans. Problem is, he says, most show up late, work slower, and are ready to head home after lunch. Some even quit after just one day out in the field.
There's a Hispanic man that works for us, and I say, he's 52, and he'll make anywhere from $70 to $100 a day. I said, if you can keep up with him and do a good job, you can make that. But they're not physically in shape to do it, and, probably not mentally tough enough to do it, some of them.
Ooh, I'm sorry. Just when you think I'm being rude. He said they're not physically in shape enough to do it, and probably not mentally enough in shape to do it either. Which means that the poor whites who were trying to be in part of the indentured servitude reality during the enslavement era are the ancestors of the poor whites today who are just terribly unsuited for actual hard work, either physically or mentally. I didn't say it. The white farmer said it. It's just a quote. I'm just telling you what the man said. So basically, it was challenging for white wealthy farmers to rely on poor whites in any meaningful way. Africans, however, were agricultural geniuses. They came not from a land of pestilence and non-hygienic lack of soap. They came from a land where, having invented soap and hygiene, having created agricultural genius such that there was a thriving continent. I mean, you had already people like Mansa Musa who had traveled the width of Africa with so much gold and excess resources because he was coming from land of such plenty coming out of Mali that he basically disrupted the economy for years because he poured so much excess into it. So when you're talking about who's capable, who's qualified, and who's not, well then, darling, it's pretty easy to understand how we are in the situation that we are today. However, white landowners realized that poor white people were a drain on the pockets. The indentured servitude system was lacking in favor, and they turned wholly to embrace the ability to buy an enslaved African, which you could own for life, as opposed to these little terribly non-farming ass white people who did not know anything and who came here with a lot of ignorance and pestilence and germs. So they had no jobs, they had no land, and they had no skills. And so how do you then, if you are a wealthy white, how do you then invest in a system of free labor where you're going to be able to go out and buy any African that you want and then keep these poor whites from organizing against you? And this was a big deal because poor white people and black people had found that, whoa, we got a whole lot in common, because you poor, I'm poor, you indentured, I'm enslaved, or I'm freed and I was never enslaved, I just happened to be here as a free black, because that also existed. And you had situations throughout history where poor white people and poor black people began collaborating, and that scared the shit out of wealthy white people. One example in particular is the Bacon's Rebellion which is a story that I've talked about a lot on this show. I'm not going to necessarily do it right now, but basically this was a moment where poor white people and poor black people, some who had been enslaved are now freed, were basically organizing, and they organized the militia under the leadership of Nathaniel Bacon, a white man who was upset with the governor of the colony of Virginia. They almost overthrew the entire colony of Virginia. And this was a point where the colony of Virginia was like 2-3 times the size of the state of Virginia right now. And that's how effective they were at organizing, because they had shared interests. We can talk about the particulars of what they were actually fighting for at Bacon's Rebellion. It wasn't necessarily holy or just, because it put them as poor whites and blacks in opposition to the indigenous. That's a story for another day. The point is this: poor white people and poor black people working together scared these folks shitless, because they almost won. They almost won. And so that's when white wealthy farmers began really investing not just in legislation, but in rules that were designed to keep poor white people and black people apart. And it was very important, because the reality was, if you had poor white people and black people collaborating, it was going to cause a whole lot of problems for the wealthy whites. And we are going to, at a point, get to where I'm talking about how this is related to what happened in Kerr County. Just stick with me for a minute, because this is where we see the roots of fiscal conservatism. Let's pause here. After enslavement, right, we had this period known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a period from roughly 1865 to 1877, like 12 years of integration 1.0. This was a period where, kind of like how we have integration right now, we had like 60 good years of integration from 1964 until 2025. When Donald Trump came into office and destroyed it. But basically, and not that it was doing everything it was supposed to do anyway, but basically integration 1.0 was a period known as Reconstruction. This was a time when the Confederate states had been kicked, they had left the Union, so they no longer had voting rights. And so if they were coming back into the Union, they had to rewrite their constitutions. During this time period, black people who were granted voting rights by the 15th Amendment were able to basically outnumber white people when it came to leadership in electoral positions. So you had in states like South Carolina, states like Mississippi, where black people were able to, because they were the only ones who could vote, because the white people who had been a part of the Confederacy were treasons. They were no longer citizens. They were not allowed to vote. And so black people were not just working to save themselves, but they were also putting together systems that were going to help class connections. And so this wonderful article out of Dissent magazine talks about the fact that this was a really powerful time. It's called The Austerity Politics of White Supremacy, out of Dissent magazine. And they talk about the fact that in the South, after the Civil War, under the protection of the federal troops and the radical Republican Congress, because this was back in the time when the Republicans were not the white nationalists, the Democrats were, which is why when people are saying the Democrats were the party of slavery, bitch, we know that, we don't care, because whiteness is not, and white supremacy is not limited by a political party. It's a governing philosophy. It's an identity. So it was going to show up in Democrats, it's going to show up in Republicans, it's going to show up everywhere. They act like it's a flex, like we don't know history, but they don't know history, so I guess it is a flex for them. Basically, in the South after the Civil War, black people who were electing themselves to office, into the houses of Congress, into the state and local and federal positions that were available to them as elected officials, they were basically also coalescing with poor white allies from the North and from the South's poorer regions. They were doing things like using their political power to raise taxes so that they could fund systems that were going to benefit everybody, like public school. Like public school, which did not exist, because one thing wealthy white people were not trying to do was educate the poor white people. Black people coming into office during Reconstruction, black people did that. And basically they worked with poor white people to essentially create systems that were going to allow the poor, regardless of their race, to be able to access something close to the American dream. All across the South, this was pissing wealthy white people the fuck off. They could not stand it, because it was like, wait a minute, we've invested so much in this notion of whiteness. How dare you act like you're going to collaborate with the N-words? I almost said it. I almost said the N-word. Child, I was too much in character. I almost said the N-word. Basically, the wealthy whites was like, how dare you poor whites be working with these N-words? Who do you think you are? You're white. You ain't supposed to do that. And so because the black people who were in leadership at this time were raising taxes, using their elected legislative power to raise taxes on the wealthy and the middle class so that they could fund these sorts of systems, like healthcare systems, like public school systems, this is where we see the roots of fiscal conservatism. Because what essentially began happening was that the wealthy whites began developing a two-part strategy of opposition. You can see all of this in the Dissent magazine article. They basically said that poor white people and the N-words who they are collaborating with are stupid. They're stupid because they're raising taxes and they're spending too much goddamn money. They are not fiscally conservative. And so when wealthy white people saw that poor white people and poor black people were using this newfound political power to fix bridges, to fix roads, to provide for schools, to create and cultivate healthcare systems, they basically identified that sort of taxing and spending as ignorant black people shit. And that if you were really a white person who was in alignment with white identity, you were going to be one of the people who were a fiscal conservative. Because one thing we cannot do is put taxes on the people who can afford to pay the taxes to pay for the people who can't. That's communism. This is before communism became a real fear in this society. So basically, the people who were in opposition to Integration 1.0 painted themselves as respectable whites who were fiscally conservative. And that means we don't spend money on needless things for society. If you need something from society, you are obviously not a successful white, because a successful white can meet their own goddamn needs. They don't need anything from society. They can have private schools. They can have tutors to come to their house. They don't need a societal safety net. And so the roots of fiscal conservatism really are in the roots of destroying Reconstruction, which is in the roots of birthing Jim Crow. And that gets us to Kerr County, Texas. I know y'all thought it was going to take me longer to get there, but here we are. Or some of you thought I'd get there quicker, whatever. Just follow along. Essentially, what was happening after Reconstruction is they would have these conventions known as taxpayer conventions, a sense of pride in fighting against taxes, a sense of racial pride that says only the Negroes, only the N-words want to tax and spend. Only the people who are in aligned with those N-words who really should be in slaves on our plantation, they're the ones who want to tax and spend. So anyone who is in alignment with this idea that we will use taxes across the broader population to support resources and a social safety net, you're an N-word lover. That got started in Reconstruction. That's not new. This is a Reconstruction era approach to redefining what whiteness was going to look like. And so when I began reading about what was happening in Kerr County, I was reminded of what W.E.B. Du Bois discussed in his book, Black Reconstruction in America, also cited in this article from Dissent, where he says that, quote, the fact that poor men were ruling and taxing rich men was the center of the corruption charge made by wealthy Southern whites against the Reconstruction governments. Basically, W.B. Du Bois was talking about the fact that they said essentially to tax rich people, to make them pay for things that poor people cannot get on their own, it's corruption. It's corruption. This is where we get the roots of today's fiscal conservatism. Now, what does this have to do with Kerr County and the fact that over 100 people have died in these flood waters, and the fact that we now learned in the aftermath that they didn't have the warning systems that they needed? They knew that they just had another deadly ass flood in 1987. They've had repeated deadly ass floods in this community and have tried, the white people in Kerr County have tried to get access to government funding to pay for a warning system, something that was going to allow them to be able to have access to the resources to know when the flood waters of the river were rising, because the Guadalupe River, and the irony of the name of this river, considering what's happening in this country today, the Guadalupe River, seriously. Moving on, they knew that they needed a warning system. They had submitted multiple applications to the state of Texas for a warning system. They had been rejected on a whole host of reasons. And what we learned from this article, and this is an article from the Texas Tribune, and the article is entitled, Did Fiscal Conservatism, hold on, let me get the title of the article, because we got to make sure y'all got the citations. We want to be educated in this space. Yes, here we go. Did fiscal conservatism block plans for a new flood warning system in Kerr County? The answer is largely yes. And so what we learned in this article is that when it came time to pay for the installation of a warning system that multiple previous floods had clearly demonstrated, previous deadly floods had clearly demonstrated that they were going to need, there was some fiscal conservatism that worked against their best interests. According to the report, quote, in the week after the tragic July 4th flooding in Kerr County, the same day that the Republicans at the federal level were celebrating the passage of the big bitch ass bill, which was going to undermine any of the state's ability to do any of this for themselves anyway. But in the week after that tragedy, several officials have blamed taxpayer pressure as the reason flood warning sirens were never installed along the Guadalupe River. The public reeled at the cost, said Kerr County Judge Rob Kelly. He told reporters after the rain pushed the river up 32 feet, resulting in 100 deaths in the county as of Thursday. A community that, quote, overwhelmingly voted for President Donald Trump in 2016, 2020, and 2024. Kerr County constructed an economic engine along the allure of the Guadalupe River. Government leaders acknowledged the need for more disaster mitigation, including a $1 million flood warning system that would better alert the public to emergencies to sustain that growth. But they were hamstrung by a small, tight-fisted tax base. And the article goes on to describe all of the community commissioners' reports that they had had. They had had a lot of conversations and hearings about getting access to this funding, and they could never come up with the funding on themselves because fiscal conservatism, as a function of whiteness, says we don't pay for these sorts of investments in a broader societal need. We don't do that because that's not fiscally conservative, and we're white fiscal conservatives. So even though they had had multiple experiences of death as a result of not having a warning system, they were also a part of their whiteness not willing to invest in doing something that was going to benefit all of them because their notions of community are fucked up. They ain't got no NIA. The collective, where in Kwanzaa we understand NIA, the collective vocation is the development and the restoration of our people. They don't have that. They have selfish, rugged individualism. And so for years they were trying to get this warning system in place. And yet, when President Joseph Robinette Biden came into office and the Democrats passed the American Rescue Plan, Kerr County in 2021 didn't get the $970,000 grant that they had requested before. They didn't get the $1 million grant that they had requested multiple times. They got offered a $10.2 million windfall. $10.2 million windfall from the American Rescue Plan that Congress had passed that same year. Corpus Christi got $15 million, and they got their money to rehabilitate and replace their aging stormwater infrastructure. Waco County, they got $868,000. They got an absolute $10.2 million windfall from the American Rescue Plan. And what was so interesting to me was that we had these people who then, upon hearing that they were getting access to this money, who had asked and requested that they were going to get the ability to be able to invest in their warning system because they had so many people die before. They didn't want the money because it came from the Democrats. They didn't want the money because it came from Joseph Biden and the Democrats, but they didn't want to give the money back because they were told that if they give the money back, the money was going to go to the Democrats. And so they went and they stood up in court. They had hearings about what to do with the $10.2 million fucking dollars that the Democrats was going to give to them so they could invest in this system that would have saved the lives of 27 little white girls who was from the Christian community. And they stood up in this hearing. Amina, do we have the clip of the hearing? Y'all listen to this. I was trying to find the video so you could see it. I can't find it. Just take a listen to the conversations that these people had as they testified about what they did not want to use the money for. Take a listen.
Now, good people, voices like Lori Daniel Favors in her powerful podcast, as featured in this video, is saying the same thing. She's exposing how whiteness was never built to last. It was built to dominate. But now, that dominance is fading off. But let's take it back. Where did this begin? For centuries, whiteness was a currency. From slavery times, where black bodies were forced to build wealth they never owned, to laws that barred black families from owning properties, to banks refusing black mortgages, to the corporate world where whiteness alone could open doors. Whiteness was a key. The system was designed to keep one race ahead and the other one at the bottom. White people didn't just survive, they thrived. Not always because of effort that they are making, but because of a system rigged in their favor. But today, that system is breaking down. Why? Because black people have learned the tactics of survival. They've mastered the economic game, they are creating their own wealth, they are telling their own stories and broken through in education, politics, and culture. Black communities have stopped waiting for a seat at the table and started building their own. And suddenly, whiteness no longer guarantees success. Shocking, isn't it? It's really shocking because we never used to this. From the civil rights movement to the Black Panthers, from court battles to marches in the streets, from grassroots organizing to global protests, black people have fought tooth and nail through the system just to be recognized as human beings. They challenged unjust laws, broke barriers in education, infiltrated corporate spaces, and built thriving communities despite every obstacle. Every inch of recognition black people have today wasn't given to them. They fought for it. And now, black people have learned the system, mastered it, outgrown it. They are no longer asking for a seat at the table. They are building their own table for them to sit on. And to my white listeners watching this video, this isn't an attack on you. This is a reality. The illusion of racial supremacy is collapsing, and you could see that very clearly. And clinging to it will only leave you behind. Let's board this ship of oneness, togetherness, and make the world a better place for all of us, black, white, brown, and pink. As Lori Daniel Favors reminds us, systems collapse when they can't evolve, and whiteness as a system of dominance is collapsing, and the world is shifting to merit, resilience, and unity, not skin color as you are used to. So the question is, will you evolve with the world, or will you fall with the system that once guided you and is now failing? Be wise. Follow the right candidates. Now, please drop your thoughts in the comment section, and this is AfriVlog.